Dr. Christiane Northrup is a legend as an author, a speaker, a medical doctor who has championed many avenues of alternative thinking when it comes to health, especially in women's health and well-being. She is sage-like in her wisdom, and she certainly has some extraordinary views on COVID and COVID-19 that I think will be very instructive for you, something that will maybe change how you think about COVID and maybe how you're going to respond to the environment that we're in right now. This is a very in-depth interview with some significant orientation, really some philosophy, some spirituality, some understanding of health and well-being. She certainly has a pretty impressive academic pedigree, but she also is an extraordinary thinker with a big heart. So, rare combination. This is a special interview. I hope you'll enjoy it. Dr. Northrup, I've been very much looking forward to this conversation because you've been out there for quite a period of time talking about things that are very relevant to today's COVID world and what's going on in it. I just speaking personally, I'm a longtime admirer of your work. Read your books, and really, you've been a champion. I think has taken stands in areas that a lot of people were afraid to really roam into those areas, speak publicly about it, especially people who have degrees and credentials in academia and can practice medicine. And have adverse board regulatory action taken against them for taking or speaking out publicly in unpopular ways. You somehow had the courage to do this all these years. So if we could get started, just maybe talk about your career path, and what got you into doing what you're doing today.
Right. Well, in medical school, I started to cry when I saw a baby born. It was the most holy thing I'd ever seen. I never intended to even practice medicine. I had an aunt and an uncle who were medical doctors, and their lifestyle sucked as far as I could tell. And my dad was a dentist. We would call him holistic. We were into healthy food and Adele Davis and vitamins and organic gardening. We were called health nuts by the brother and sister who were the medical doctors. And I had two very key experiences as a kid. One, my sister was born and wouldn't eat. I was 5 years old, and she died in the hospital in a pool of her own vomit at a time when you could not hold your baby. And so my mother was given high-dose antibiotics the entire pregnancy for viral pneumonia, because back then the antibiotic was the new thing. And when the family doctor came to the house, every one of us was lined up for a shot of penicillin, no matter what the others had. So that was sort of the beginning of this is the miracle drug, and it's going to cure everything. So this was, also right after when they began to fertilize the soil, taking all of the nitrates that they used for making bombs to grow food, and it killed the microbiome, but it made the plants grow very, very tall. So it was, sort of in that time frame. I'm in the baby boom generation. Then my brother was born, and he wouldn't eat, and no one knew why. And my parents signed him out of the hospital against medical advice. My dad had worked in a MASH unit. He knew how to put down a nasogastric tube, so they fed him every hour on the hour at the age of 10. At the age of 1, he weighed 10 pounds. And they finally found a doctor who was a pioneer in pediatric endoscopy, putting down a light. And she said, his esophagus is so eroded from that tube, you've got to take it out, and we just have to watch and wait, which she did. And 2 days later, he started to eat at a year old. And we don't know why. To this day, we don't know why. He's got some sequelae, we would call it, a little rheumatoid factor, some pulmonary fibrosis, but he's very healthy. And then when I was interviewing at med schools, my dad was admitted to the intensive care unit with chest pain. They thought he had a heart attack. 2 days later, he calls my mother, come on and get me. They don't know what's going on. And they didn't. I come home, he's sitting up in a chair, fluid 2/3 of the way up in his lung fields, reading The Godfather by Mario Puzo, not able to lie down flat because of the fluid in the lungs. And he healed well at home. And he had infectious pericarditis. He did not have a heart attack. So indeed, they were treating him exactly wrong. So frame in my head, I'm ironing. My mother says, we're very worried about you going to medical school. I mean, most parents aren't saying that. We're very worried about this. We're afraid you're going to get brainwashed, just like everyone else, right? And come out with a medical deity degree. No, I said to my mother, no, I'm just going to go find out why doctors don't talk to you about what's really going on. And then when I got there, I saw the good stuff. I mean, nothing's better than orthopedic surgery or plastic surgery if you have a mangled hand. I mean, there's wonderful things about modern medicine. However, I began to see things immediately in my field of OBGYN. I saw a baby born. It was like, holy. This is holy. And the nurse was yelling at the medical student who had let go of the cord, and it was flipping blood on the walls. It's like a mini fire hose, and she's yelling, and I'm thinking, this is a holy place. There's no place here for yelling at anybody. And then I, of course, went into that field and began to push the envelope within the field. I think it was very important for my soul growth, for my soul mission, to get all the credentials. Dartmouth Medical School, Tufts New England Medical Center, board certified in OBGYN, all of the credentials that make people believe you know what you are talking about. Mm-hmm. When in fact, I just talked to a farmer yesterday, and he said when a pregnant cow gives birth to the calf, don't go near her. You will mess it up. Well, we don't know how to do birth without messing it up. And I knew we were messing it up. In fact, I was there, as a intern, when fetal monitoring first came in, and I watched the cesarean section rate soar to 25% within a year because nobody knew how to read the monitor. Mm. And to this day, there's not one single study that proves that fetal monitoring does anything more than increase the cesarean section rate. And yet, there's a fetal monitor in every birth, and when you walk into the room with a laboring woman and you say, "How are you doing?" she looks at the monitor. The nurses look at the monitor. Everyone looks at the monitor because there's something about the screen, right, that has taken over our minds and our ability to think. So, how are you? Well, I don't know. I have to look at the monitor. And I've gone into rooms where the monitor wasn't working, and everyone's still looking at the monitor. So it removes us from ourselves, you see. And that's how medicine has become. Instead of this sense of how am I doing? We look to outside objective indices. I had to, as a second year resident, I remember asking the question, when do membranes normally rupture in a normal birth? Because I'll tell you what I was learning is the minute the woman came in, you ruptured the membranes with an amnio hook, meaning you instantly take away the bubble wrap around the baby and then you screw in a scalp electrode right at the seventh chakra where the spirit comes into the body. And then you put in an intrauterine pressure catheter and you get her all hooked up. And you start a 16 gauge IV, which hurts like hell, but it's a big needle. Then, okay. And I learned that like an emergency. This is an emergency. You got to get the line in case she needs blood. You need to put in and here's the truth. When things go bad in obstetrics, they go bad fast, and it is an emergency. But you can't have the predictive programming of this is going to be an emergency. And how many movies have I watched over the years where, this couple is going along, maybe they're on the deck of the boat, whatever, and she's pregnant, and suddenly she falls to the ground and says, "Oh, John, the baby." Or, I just watched an episode of Sheriff Longmire.
And reminds me of the COVID testing now. I mean, we're scaling these COVID tests. The tests aren't the inventor of the test has said that this is not the way it's supposed to be used. 30% false positives, 20% false negatives, and we want everybody tested, and then we create policy from something that's erroneous to start with. So the whole thing seems like we've lost our minds. How are you seeing it?
That is exactly right. When you use a test that's this inaccurate, all it's going to do after a magnification cycle of maybe 17, maybe 35, all it's going to do is show you dead pieces of nucleotides. And even Fauci said that. And in our state of Maine, they're using a cutoff of 45. So this stuff, and depending on how much of a case-demic you want to do, how much fear you want to create, you can just go up and down on your CT, your threshold that you cut it off at, and then tell everybody the cases are up, the cases are up. If this isn't the Wizard of Oz, I don't know what is. Pay no attention to the man behind the screen. I was at the airport yesterday, and there's an announcement: get your COVID test here. Why would, when healthy people have to have a test to know whether or not they're healthy? I just heard this story. This is the kind of story that you hear all the time. The aunt of a friend out somewhere in California was fine, but her housekeeper tested positive. She was fine too. The daughter-in-law or someone insists on taking her to the hospital and putting her on oxygen. And then it's all of this fear mongering. And then she's finally at this, as we speak, she's on a ventilator. That's the way you murder them. That's sort of the death knell. Because, here's the thing. From the very beginning of this, starting in March, I remember thinking, well, this is easy. I saw the Zelenko protocol. I saw what he was doing with the Orthodox Jewish community in Brooklyn. By the way, the same community that was targeted for their failure to vaccinate for measles and, driving absolute hysteria in New York City around measles. By the way, that's how the whole narrative started. And I cut my teeth on testifying in front of our legislature about vaccine mandates. Everyone was finally saying, well, they'd take these schools where there were 6 kids and they'd have like 2 kids who were doing a delayed vaccination schedule or were not yet vaccinated. They'd make a percentage out of that and then tell everybody that this was the percentage of kindergartners who were not yet vaccinated. And so we needed a mandate. A mandated vaccine schedule, which has then happened in New York State, it happened in Maine, it happened in California, despite massive protest. That is 72 mandated shots by the age of 18. When I was in med school, I think the autism rate was maybe 1 in 3,000. It's now 1 in 32. If you're a Black male, your chance of autism from the MMR shot, remember that's just one shot. The chance of your autism from that one shot is 3 times greater than in a Caucasian male. And this was hidden by Thompson. That was the basis for the documentary Vaxxed. But look at the mainstream media narrative around vaccinations. You get the talking head doctors from the very best places. Well, they're safe and effective. There has been no more effective medical intervention on the planet than vaccinations, which is just not true. The public health measures that have really helped are clean water and sanitation. So, so the narrative begins to hypnotize people. And then if you're old enough, people always go, well, what about polio? And polio came out right when DDT came out, a neurotoxin. And so it's very possible that wave of polio in the 50s, the post-World War II wave of polio, was more caused by DDT, because polio is a series of viruses, just like flu is as well. And once you do the deep dive on all of this, you realize that this vaccine narrative is a false narrative. It's a false narrative. Most people who have come into contact with polio never get it. By the way, the only people getting polio on planet Earth right now are the ones vaccinated by the Gates Foundation in India and other places. I think the Gates Foundation was kicked out of India because of all the polio cases from the vaccine itself. And in that famous Disney World measles outbreak, 30% of those people had been recently vaccinated, and the germ was the one in the vaccine. But every time you do a deep dive on this, every time you find a good an article in the medical literature, the next day it's been censored. So you've had to go, you will never find any of this in the mainstream media. So anyway, we go back to the Zelenko protocol, zinc, quercetin. Trump mentioned hydroxychloroquine. So all of those of us who were interested in hydroxychloroquine, you suddenly were tainted with orange man bad. Like, wait a minute, this is a generic drug that has been out there for 60 years, and it works very well. Fauci knew, by the way, that the chloroquines worked for SARS and all of that stuff. But suddenly, doctor friends of mine could not prescribe it without making up a diagnosis other than COVID. And then a bunch of states made it impossible for doctors to prescribe something that's been out there for 60 years, that's been safely and effectively used. Now, not necessarily for COVID, for malaria, but we don't get what this thing is. Ivermectin also works. But you see the Zelenko protocol, nobody needed to die. The internists from Texas were out there. This is my protocol. It's zinc, vitamin C, vitamin D, quercetin, which is a type of hydroxychloroquine. It's a zinc ionophore. It gets the zinc into the cells. We do that, treat it early, and you're good to go. No one needed to die. So what do we hear from the mainstream media? We have the hospitals are full, people are out in the corridors, and by the way, I'm not sure that that's happening. My friends working in hospitals say, there's a lot of empty beds. But during flu season, there's always a time when there are beds in the hall. This is just very common, except that you and I both know COVID has cured the flu. There's no more flu anymore. They stopped tracking it in Massachusetts. They stopped tracking it in our state of Maine, and yet the public health authorities have tried to push a flu vaccine mandate on all healthcare workers. And in Massachusetts, Governor Baker issued an edict, Comrade Baker, he issued an edict that everyone 6 months of age to age 30 who was in a nursery school, in a private school, in a college, needed a flu shot, even though their CDC was no longer even tracking flu. And by the way, if you look at the data, the death rate in 2020 it's 0.012% higher than it was in 2019. There has been no massive epidemiologic pandemic. There just hasn't. This has all been made up. And you always know the real truth. It's the thing that you can't even post on social media. Like way back, Russell Blaylock is a world-renowned neurosurgeon. And he came out with a piece on masks and how ineffective they were. You couldn't even post it to social media. They already, when something's really good, the machines have already got it censored. And so it's like a mass hypnotic trance. And I have friends who say things like, this is how you know they've been really, really programmed. If that were true, I would have heard it on the news. Have you heard of Project Mockingbird? Have you heard of Project Paperclip? I mean, so we know that the COVID thing has a 99.9% survival rate, 99.4% if you're over 70. And of course, we know that it's in those with pre-existing conditions mostly. There is something out there that people are dying of, and it might be related to 5G and that kind of thing. But the key is you don't wait until someone, this is what they did in the beginning. Don't come back until you're really scared and you can't breathe. Then we'll put you on a ventilator. And hospitals were paid $35,000 for every person they got on a ventilator. So hospital administrators, my God, bring them in. Let's put them on ventilators. But anyhow, if you got it early and you did the protocol, nobody needed to die. So with a disease with a 99.9% recovery rate, why are we fast tracking a vaccine that we already know has a 3% very severe adverse reaction rate? You got to ask yourself this stuff.
Well, these are, the big questions. You said something earlier that, we said, oh, wow, this is like, people have this sense that this COVID world is this new thing that's emerged and et cetera. In your mind, you're saying this is the world we've been living in. It's just now becoming more evident. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes. In my field of holistic medicine, let's start with the Flexner Report. Let's go back to the 1920s. When the Rockefeller Foundation and John D. Rockefeller of Standard Oil decided that to get the market share in medicine, we should create a report that is denigrating and making quacks, they invented the term quack, out of every natural medical school, naturopathy, homeopathy, chiropractic, osteopathy, all of that. Let's close down all of those, anyone treating anything in a natural way. We'll call them quacks because the pharmaceutical industry is based on petroleum-based drugs. And then we have to get everybody on drugs. And I don't know if you remember, I remember this political slogan, prescription drugs for seniors, as though when you hit 65, you suddenly need prescription drugs, which is BS. I mean, but the average 65-year-old in our country is on 6 prescription drugs. But anyway, so it started with this very systematic witch hunt. Well, actually, we could go back even further to the actual witch hunts, which were the economy of Europe for 300 years. The guillotines, the stuff. Who were they going after? Who were the witches? They were women and men who practiced herbology and natural medicine, and who were the intuitives. So it's as though there has been on planet Earth a very long-standing, systematic force to get rid of everything connected with nature and with intuition and with joy. Vitamin D. We were taught as physicians to be afraid of vitamin D. Dermatologists have taught us to be afraid of the sun, where we get our life force. So it took from the 1990s when we began to realize that the sickest people were the ones with really low levels of vitamin D. Optimal is 40 to 80. I think it's nanograms per ml. And by the way, the website of all time for vitamin D is grassrootshealth.net. This was started by a woman who said, I am so tired of waiting around for this to get into mainstream practice. And now we've found, for instance, with COVID, I believe that the National Health Service in England finally began to send out vitamin D capsules to all the people at the National Health Service. That's the first thing we should have been doing. Then what's the other narrative? This is a great one. The other narrative is people of color need to get the vaccine first. No, that people of color, yes, they are dying of COVID. Anyone who is not healthy, anyone who's systematically held down and abused is going to get sick from everything first. I work with Kevin Jenkins of the Urban Global Health Alliance. Kevin is Black. He said, as a Black man, I know a thing or two about slavery. The vaccination cabal is the gateway to global human slavery. And when you do a deep dive on what may be in one or the other of them, you see that that is actually true. And so he has led, with many colleagues, an entire movement of people of color, Native Americans, Black Americans, and people all over the world, to have the public health officials get the vaccine first. We'll watch you. They remember the systematic eugenics program. It turns out Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, and this I did not know, as you might imagine. I mean, I used to be an abortion provider. She was a eugenicist. The Rockefellers are eugenicists, the Rockefeller Foundation. So it is to create an Aryan race of a few people and kill the rest and enslave just the amount that you need. I mean, I get on my tinfoil hat and I say to people, The Matrix, the movie, that's a documentary. And that's, we've been leading up to this. As I have watched my colleague Jonathan Wright had the FDA come into his office at gunpoint years ago because I think he was giving IV vitamin C. I've had other doctors where if they were holistic and really doing a great job with things like cancer and so on, they would fear for their life, for their licenses. Just recently, Paul Thomas, a renowned pediatrician in Oregon who wrote the Vaccine Friendly Plan, published a study of unvaccinated versus vaccinated children and found that the unvaccinated ones were far healthier. So, of course, he had to lose his license. They finally got him. This is what it has been to be practicing holistic medicine for the last 30, 40 years. COVID is the same thing, but on steroids. So when this whole thing started and I was listening to the narrative and all of that, like many of my colleagues, I knew it. Although let me say, the dream spell is so hypnotic, tell, lie vision that even my holistic colleagues, are many of them. I had a massage therapist who came to my house for years. Whole thing started, nope, it's too dangerous. I've got to wear a mask. I've got to keep my older clients healthy. There's never been good science for this, which has led Pam Popper out of Ohio, who teaches health classes and has a business in 6 countries and was in the movie Forks Over Knives, I believe. She called this whole thing fact-free hysteria from the very beginning, using the PCR test to pump up the cases. And then, as you remember this early on, again in the spring, everyone who died of COVID. You fell out of an airplane and the parachute didn't open, COVID death. I mean, I remember listening to doctors talk about one very famous one, Scott Jensen, an MD and also a senator in Minnesota, was called before the board because he questioned being told how to fill out a death certificate. He's been doing that for 40 years. He was Doctor of the Year in Minnesota, a renowned family physician. And he was censured for questioning the death certificate situation. And then you also know that the Royal College model of how many people were going to die, that was instantly found out to be a scam. So he left it. So what I want people to know is there are nefarious characters running the narrative, and that includes completely hijacked agencies, the CDC, the FDA, the WHO. The AMA, by the way, the American Medical Association, just came out with an updated minutes of their meeting saying that hydroxychloroquine was safe and effective and doctors should be using it. It's like, where you been? You're a day late and $1 short. Who paid you off? And I think that that's what we're looking at is a worldwide control structure. We could talk about the COVID vaccine. It does something. It's not really a vaccine. We've never had anything like it. It's an mRNA transfection, it's called. So it's going to go in and change your the cellular operating system so that your body will produce antibodies against the spike protein of the COVID virus. The problem is this virus, like every other virus, is already mutated. And they fast tracked this. We've never, ever had a successful mRNA vaccine. They tried with H1N1, which, by the way, killed far more people than this. And apparently, according to some of my sources, the Obama administration said, stop testing. There were so many people getting it, just stop testing. Then they came out with the vaccine, the H1N1 vaccine. Many, many people got narcolepsy, and many people died of that. This one, I'll tell you what's really concerning. It's not that you'll probably be okay with the first dose, although we do know that people have died already in the clinical trials. It is then, it's going to do something to your immune system so that it will, on the second round, when your body sees either this virus or something like it, it will mount a cytokine storm, an antibody reaction, like pathogenic programming, that will then probably kill you. So I was doing a Facebook Live with my colleague, Dr. Larry Pilevsky, a wonderful pediatrician who also testified with me at these vaccine mandate hearings. I mean, you should have seen us. We're going around thinking that if you just talk to your legislators, if you give them the science, if you, who are on the front lines treating children, show them that this is how you stay healthy and this is not needed, we thought that that would work. This is not an intellectual discussion. This is cognitive dissonance. Pam Popper talked about it as